I should just start by saying I'm not a designer. I'm actually a producer at a theatre Royal Stratford East, but I've had a connection with designers for a long time, from being at the National and contracting designers, and also being part of Limbury Prize for Stage Design, which some of you might know about. So it's really lovely to be here, and in particular with some people that I've met through Limbury in the past. So if I could just ask everybody to just introduce themselves initially, and then we can just have maybe a bit of a 40-minute chat or so before we open the floor to questions towards the end, if that's all right with everyone. So Camilla, do you want to just say who you are?
Hi, I'm Milla. I'm a designer. Yeah?
I'm Rosie. I'm a designer, and I worked here for a year, and also have worked with Tom quite a lot, and now designing stuff by myself.
Ellen.
Hi, I'm Ellen McDougall. I run the Gate Theatre.
And
I'm
you're?
Rob Drummer. I'm Artistic Director at Boundless Theatre.
That's great. I mean, I think today the focus really is twofold. I think we're interested in obviously talking about designers starting out, what that means, what to think about, but also the bigger question about a vision for design going forward in the future, what that means, how the industry should be responding to that, both as artists and as venues, in order to support things and changes and challenging the status quo where we need to. I wonder actually whether, Camilla, if we could maybe start the conversation with you about, because obviously I met you for the first time through Limbury, because Camilla was one of the 12 finalists at the Limbury Prize for Stage Design in 2015, and ended up winning the Royal Court Commission. And I believe you're working at the court at the moment, aren't you?
Yeah, I am. So I'm working upstairs, which is the space that I did with the Limbury, and I'm working with Vicky on a show called Bad Roads. We're in fit up at the moment, and we start tech next week. So
yeah. And tell us a little bit about your experience of the whole Limbury Prize pathway, how you sort of decided to put yourself forward for it, and what that has meant for you as a platform as an emerging designer.
It's quite a journey, I think. Yeah, because I went to Royal Welsh College, and hello, and then I think it's quite the Limbury is quite prominent from the time that you start. You sort of know, you're introduced to the idea of it, and you get to meet students that have also been at the Royal Welsh that have done it. So it's very much part of the conversation, the design conversation when you start. So I was always aware of it, and I'd gone up to see previous Limbury Prizes that students before us had taken part in. It was always very much part of the conversation. And I actually left uni wanting to be a puppet maker, and then realised, and then through conversations with my head of year and stuff, was sort of channeled towards the think about design stuff, and ended up doing my first couple of designs after leaving college, and then deciding to apply for it. Not thinking that anything would really come of it, that I'd just give it a go to meet all these to meet these people, and to actually question my own practice about actually what I wanted to do. And I think Limbury really does that. It meeting these directors kind of really makes you think about your work as a maker and as a designer. So did that. But I can't remember what the last bit of the conversation, the question was.
Well, what you feel Limbury has allowed you as a designer since sort of doing that first commission for the court, which was again upstairs, where you find yourself again now, this time with Vicky.
I think the Limbury is obviously an incredible process, and it introduces you to people in the industry. And what was quite hard, I think, when I was doing it, is that I was trying to do a job at the time, so I was like racing back and forth to Cardiff trying to finish a job, and then coming back here, and so you know, you still have to keep juggling loads of stuff, but you're always incredibly good about those two things coexisting together, and I think it just sort of, it is really nerve-wracking, and really you sort of have to work really hard and all that stuff, but it's amazing to meet people. And then I did my show, and actually you're very young at this point, and the court really looked after me and taught me loads of stuff. You're working with professionals that have had years more experience than you, but what's amazing about that process is I never felt like I was being treated as a young designer. I was always given a lot of respect and asked a lot of questions, which is why I keep wanting to be working there, and why I'm working there now, I think. I don't know how the other theatres were, but I know that that's what the court did for me.
Yeah, I think a lot of past commissioning companies have probably found that they've continued, once they've had that relationship through Limbury, they've continued working with those designers. Rosie, I know that you did apply for Limbury, because I remember meeting you at that point, and you didn't make it through the last 12 to be able to exhibit and work with any of the commissioning companies. So it's quite interesting to hear how, you're at a point where you're designing on a similar scale to Camilla, but yet you've taken a very, well, not a completely different route, but it's important to understand that Limbury is not, it's not the only pathway, to sort of fast track yourself through. And I think it does offer that with a lot of pressure attached to it. Tell us a little bit about, after you've graduated.
How I've come to do what I'm doing now. So I applied for the Limbury Prize, and then it's kind of at the same time actually, I got a job here for a year as the resident design assistant, and that was really it was a lot of observing, I suppose, how a building works, assisting the different designs that came in. I worked, Tom became the what's Tom's title, associate designer, at the same time as I became the first resident design assistant, so I worked with him a lot, and at the same time as I was doing that, I was doing kind of little bits and pieces of my own work, which I suppose so I did some projects with people that I know, some dance and some more kind of performance arty stuff, which is, I'm very interested in that. And then when I left here, I suppose slightly having worked here for a year was useful, but did a project at the Gate with Chris Hayden, who was the artistic director before Ellen, and a project at the Yard. So kind of just making stuff really, but and I suppose I think how I've got to design different things in the past couple of years is just finding people that want to make stuff for the same reasons that you do, and it kind of doesn't really matter. Like doing this show at the court, the director that I'm working with, we just kind of had a creative connection, I suppose, and he wanted to work with me, but I suppose not doing the Limbury Prize or having that time maybe to do a bit more incubating has allowed me to work quite a lot of stuff out, the stuff that I want to make. Yeah.
And also the way you talk about yourself as a designer, and certainly how you've assisted Tom on projects, has been quite different to perhaps how most people would imagine an assistant or an associate. It's not been about practical model making, it's not been about drawing, it's been a very different...
Yeah, well, I'm not very good.
At model making? Right, okay.
Or it's like, I'm all right, but it's not the way that I guess I do a lot of thinking, is maybe how I design. And drawing and other bits and pieces, but so working with Tom as his associate, I was doing lots of research and being sometimes in the rehearsal room for him, or sometimes slightly co-designing things with him. So that was being an assistant in a slightly different way. So I guess I've been feeding my imagination for, that feels like my personally my best tool, wanting to imagine new stuff.
Yeah, and you feel that sometimes, I mean, you were talking a little bit earlier about how certain types of process will drive you towards a certain type of design, and that actually we need to challenge that perhaps to be able to refresh
well,
what
it's
design
finding
can be.
it's finding direct. I mean, me and Ellen just did a project together, and that was totally amazing. And I think it's finding brains that work like your or in similar work in similar ways to your brain that allow you to have a certain type of process. So it feels like, and especially when you're studying, as maybe quite a lot of you are, there's like that one very particular way that you design play, and it's like you do some research, then you put that research into you make a model, then you give that model to a workshop and they make it, and then the actors do some acting on this thing that you've designed. And I think that there's something about having a freer process, or we did like our like a week of R&D where we learned tons, and we actually kind of did have an idea about the design, but that informed what we made, just as having real bodies in the space. That's what I'm a massive fan of, because that's as a designer or as a theatre maker, really the most powerful and brilliant thing about theatre is like some people with some other people talking about a thing. Like that's that's why it's amazing. And sometimes I feel like if you don't think about that and you're focused on making a beautiful model, quite a lot of crap gets in the way of that interaction or that thing. So I think I don't know what that means specifically, like for a new type of process, but I'm excited to just try new stuff out.
I mean, Ellen, as a director, do you want to talk a little bit about how those different processes can inspire different end results, and how you worked maybe on that particular piece?
Yes, sure. So I suppose just kind of I could talk through a bit the process, maybe. I think I really feel similar to Rosie, that it feels increasingly important to me that the conversation you have with a designer or with a director is one where that's about kind of why you're doing what you're doing, and what your values are, I suppose, or why you care about theatre or why it should matter. And I think we both kind of started with a really clear feeling for the particular show that we were making, that was something that we just kept coming back to, which was about people in a room now, which is, sounds, well, it is in a way incredibly simple, but that became quite a kind of touchstone for us. And there were moments, I think, we've had conversations since about what that process was, and it was kind of quite unnerving in some ways, because we sort of quite quickly knew what we thought we wanted it to be. And then we had moments of going, but maybe there needs to be more, or maybe there needs to be like other stuff as the design. And so we went down these sort of roads where we put other things into the model, and we looked at other pictures and tried lots of other things, and in the end we kind of kept coming back to the bodies in the space, as Rosie said. So that was, I think that was the really important thing. And I suppose that goes to a kind of process thing that I'm thinking about a lot at the moment, which is like the invisible work before you start having any evidence of what the show might be like, a scene description or a picture of some blocking, or even a reference picture. That like deep thinking about why you're doing it and what the thing is that you want to say and what its relationship with the world is so important to have the time for that. And I think we live in such a kind of quick world. I certainly feel like I have a tendency to want to end game things, go, but what's the show going to look like, and what kind of colour lights, and actually kind of constantly going back to, but why are we sort of doing it, means that in the end those choices are more rooted in an idea about why, rather than some like good stuff, which is also nice, you know. But
And I know that you have other concerns about not just the process, but also things like the importance of thinking about sustainability and choices and how things are made. And I don't know if you want to sort of talk about some of that a little bit, you know, for people to sort of think about that, because obviously you have a venue as well, so you're not just in and out of somewhere. There's a responsibility as a venue to consider those things and the impact it has on everything.
yeah, well, I guess when I saw the title of this talk and it was about the future, I thought, well, what are the things I worry about and what are the things that I think are important to factor in when we think about how we work. And kind of one of the big ones is actually a conversation that Claire Slater and I have worked a lot on, so it's appropriate that we're having it in this room, is to do with sustainability and how we make work in the context of climate change, and how we think about, like, design in itself is a kind of high impact part of making theatre. You know, like, we have an aesthetic and a rhythm in the way that we produce theatre in this country, which is that, you know, we make big impressive sets and we spend lots of money on them and they look amazing and the audience expect that and want that, and then we put it all in the bin after 4 weeks, or hopefully recycle a bit of it and then kind of do another one. And that's kind of part of a much bigger kind of culture that we're in, that is about a kind of disposable culture and wanting things to be constantly new. And I suppose, like, I've got a sort of question about that in terms of, I don't know what to do with it, but I sort of feel as though there's something about, like, connecting with the questions about the climate and the context of that in the way we approach work. And I guess now that I'm in the fortunate position of running a venue, I've got the opportunity to kind of look at the way we produce work and the way the kind of structures that we have. And I was it was interesting making The Unknown Island, which was the show that Rosie and I made together, because it was the first show I'd done as an artistic director, and I was really conscious of lots of pressure coming from lots of places, as you always have when you make a show. But one of the things I noticed was something about time and the kind of the moment that you sort of commit to a design, you've then got a certain amount of time to realise it. And that time is based on a kind of process in which a production manager will go and buy the stuff, cost it up, and off it goes. So then adding an extra moment where you go, could we think about this? Could we think about achieving this idea differently that has a different impact? It doesn't feel at the moment like there's kind of space for that in the process, because you want it to be brilliant and you've got a process that will enable you to get what you want, so you just do that. And I suppose I'm kind of having a moment of going, what other things do we need in that process to enable those conversations to happen in a way that isn't stressful and doesn't make it feel like you're compromising.
I mean, I don't know if either of you have any particular thoughts on that particular question of design.
Of sustainability?
Yeah, and how that potentially impacts on choices and...
Yeah, I mean, this is connected but not the same thing. One of the things I'm really interested in about the idea of the new, and as a designer, constantly doing something different every time. And I'm quite interested in asking a similar question again and again. And I wonder if there's, like, what if you were to use the same stuff? I don't know, because that stuff excited you 6 months ago, so why not test it out again? Or I don't know, there's something about, it's different from, I think about the difference between fine artists and designers. And that as a fine artist you could do 20 white paintings that were all slightly different sizes, and that would be, well, not just fine but kind of expected, because you would be honing a part of your craft. But as a designer you're like, and now you do a perfect room, and now you do a da-da-da, and now you do a big glitter cut, or whatever it is that you're doing. But maybe there's something on about allowing people to be slower with that, and reuse ideas. And also the sustainability of the human beings as well is connected, because being a designer is very hard, and that can sometimes feel unsustainable. And I'm sure that all those different conversations are connected in a way. How you respect the materials, how you respect the people. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that you touched on a little bit earlier when we were chatting before here, and I imagine that in particular when you're starting out, how so much harder that is, because you're not necessarily working at venues that are going to be at a certain scale where they're paying very well. It's how do you manage that? How do you manage the balance of being able to execute work well, keep yourself well, but actually earn enough to be able to feel that you're advancing in your chosen career?
It's quite a hard thing, I'd say. Yeah, I guess that you always end up. What I kind of love about working in smaller venues is that actually you are encouraged to use the materials again and again and again and again. Like use the same costumes but chop them up and use them in a different way, or expose material, use one material, why use 5 when you can use 1, which is kind of better in you know, I think the decision making in smaller spaces is can be a lot simpler, and because of the size of the venue, you're not, you know, I think there comes a grandeur with doing stuff at bigger venues, so you are expected to use a lot more materials and to go bonker, you know, and to exploit every sort of material that you can, whereas in I think with smaller venues it's I don't know if you'd agree with me, it's possibly easier.
I guess in response to what you just said, I don't think it is possible.
No.
Just to make enough money, make work that you're excited by, have good mental health. I'd say in the system that we're in the way that theatre's made right now, or it's not possible.
So what do we need to do about it? I think that's a big question.
Well, wages, I guess, are a thing for I mean, I don't know what the answer to like arts funding question is, but like that is a massive thing. And also just like, how do we talk about it? How many people in a producing team know what it takes to make a thing and how long it takes? Because there can be you can feel a bit like Rumpelstiltskin when you're making stuff and like you know, just like doing all this mad stuff and then like expecting to produce something out magically. But it would be really great if it was much more open, like actually that takes this amount of time. That takes this amount of time. I'm tired, I need more support, whatever.
So it's about venues and producers and the industry just generally having a better understanding of what your process is, and
I think
and
that's
how
a
it
big
needs
thing,
to support it.
because that's the thing, you know. I sort of come back to the wage thing is when you're, you know, to live in London, you have to pay a certain amount of rent every month, and to achieve that, you know, in terms of the way that it's going to sound really boring, like invoicing work, sometimes you don't get paid monthly, you get paid like every 2.5 months or something. So what you get like a wedge of something, and that has to make it last. So then you end up taking on 2 or 3 more jobs to try and sustain doing that, and by doing that your process then becomes really chaotic. So because you know you can't be in the room all the time, in the rehearsal room, which is where the best decisions are made and when the most exciting things are discovered, but because you've committed to another 2 shows to try and earn enough money to live, you can't do that. So your process ends up being really quick and quite chaotic, and then you don't get to spend enough time as a designer. Sometimes I feel like I don't have enough time in the room, and that's when you really feel like an artist, I think, is when you're there, when you're present. Absolutely. Ellen, what did you want to say about that?
Well, I was just going to say that I sometimes wonder whether the structure around how we pay and contract designers in terms of like both time and money is maybe it's about understanding and a conversation about what it costs and takes to make a piece of work, and for you to feel like an artist, as you say, to have enough time in the room to make the right decisions and not just churn out something again and again. But I think I sometimes wonder, and I don't know enough about this to really know, but I sometimes wonder whether there's a kind of historic thing where design was about kind of like just like the backdrop or it started off as like a good backdrop, and I just wonder whether our structure is sort of still based on that.
Yeah, totally.
But actually what we're asking for from designers is to be almost like a dramaturg, a co-collaborator, make the show with you, but they're still contracted and paid as if they're just making a backdrop, or just that's crude, and I don't know how the history of it is, but that's sort of my impression of what that relationship sort of, where that disconnect is happening. And it's not like directors are paid enough either, to be honest, but like there is a thing about recognising what designers are doing
and how early they are involved in that
Yeah.
process in terms of supporting the conceptual visualisation of a production.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know the answer, I'm afraid, but yeah, I think a lot of people recognise that it's really tough, and it takes a lot of either just stretching yourself across far too many projects, which compromises you as an artist, or having some other sort of support network that provides a buffer for you to be able to work in that way. So
Well, there are sort of, I'm with you, Ellen. I think there are all sorts of invisible structures that prop up the way theatre is made that have been passed down, and there's a sort of sense of received wisdom and not necessarily having the headspace to challenge that within a producing model or within kind of running a venue or a company. And so the artists are sort of brought in to deliver within those structures, and you fight to kind of find the resource and the time to do that. And yeah, without knowing the history of kind of how contracts are drawn up necessarily, but I do know from kind of how writers' agreements work that they're not advancing quickly enough in terms of how theatre is being made. And I think design contracts, directors' contracts, I think they're kind of built upon 10, 20, 30 years worth of how theatre was done. And if we're looking to the future, and we've got a generation of artists who are sort of chomping at the bit to kind of work differently, but a venue or a producer is kind of working within an industry and within sort of structures and contracts and agreements that have to be followed to a certain sense, whether you're kind of signed up to an industry body or whether you're dealing with trade unions. Like there are certain things that we're told we have to do, and yet when I'm meeting with kind of younger artists, like there's a real sense, some of the chats that Rosie and I've had, I'm kind of like, well, why can't we do something differently? Why can't we kind of push in a slightly different direction, I suppose, without having a venue and kind of having some freedom to kind of pick where the space might be or what the space might look like, and actually having a little longer to plan that stuff. Maybe we're looking at 2-year cycles or 3-year cycles. I've just come from a meeting with a bunch of artists today where we're building design into the R&D, the conceptual development, and we're probably at least 2 years out from having its first public performance. And we're fighting for the money so that everybody's paid to be part of that. It can be a significant part of that. Having worked in venues, those same things aren't necessarily always available to you. But I think we have this kind of problem opening up across any sort of creative discipline in theatre, which is we've got a generation of artists who want to make work which maybe we don't have the audience for, or the kind of structures for, or the kind of space for. And what do? You start kind of compromising, you start working within the structure without knowing you're doing it, as opposed to feeling supported to fight for a slightly different way of working. I would say we can change that. It takes a lot of buy-in, it takes a lot of listening, it takes a lot, these sorts of spaces are useful because you can air those things, and we can go away and think, well, actually in our organisations we can affect that, we can change that. These spaces aren't frequent enough, I suppose.
No, and I mean, talk a little bit, Rob, about what you're doing, because you're Boundless Theatre, and you're predominantly working creating work for young people and with young people, and in particular, I often feel that a lot of work, participation work that happens in theatre in particular within schools, focuses very much on the writer, the director, being an actor, and actually not enough is talked about early enough about potentially looking at design as a career path into the arts.
Yeah, I think that's really fair. I think there's certainly a lack of that within a sort of curriculum. There is a slight introduction to what design might be, but that isn't necessarily rigorous at sort of GCSE level or earlier. And so there is definitely a job to be done about demystifying what that career path is and the ways into it, and there are numerous ways into it. I suppose our work is focused around sort of young adults and teenagers, so our audience starts at 15 and kind of goes up to about 25, so we're not dealing with sort of children, we're kind of looking at a generation right now of people who are sophisticated and culturally engaged and kind of responding politically and in other ways kind of to a culture that is moving very quickly. So we have an audience that we see as really discerning, actually, and really sophisticated, and who kind of demand our respect. And so with that kind of audience focus, and it is a very particular, very specific audience focus, we want to be engaging and empowering artists to work with that generation, this generation of young adults. So no matter what you might be coming in to do for Boundless, you are spending a lot of time with teenagers. And I think every artist who goes through that process sort of comes back with their kind of minds blown a little bit about how demanding and how exciting that group of people are to make work for. A generation who are attending kind of gigs and engaging in kind of visual culture across the board, who might step into theatre for the very first time, and so don't have any sense of expectation or what the rules are, and the rules are there to be broken, I think, for this audience. So we want to find a space, yes, in schools to kind of hopefully break away from just writer, director, performer sort of routes, to kind of take artists directly into those environments is our way at the moment. To professionalise teenagers earlier. I think if you're a 15-year-old and you look at the cost of education, especially creative education, and the time it takes, I think at 15 you're like, my mates are going to go off and earn a ton of money and do all sorts of things in app development or whatever. I haven't got the time to waste on that. And I think, you know, you could be hitting your mid to late 20s before you can say, actually, I feel professional as an artist. And at the age of 15, that can feel a bit daunting. So we're looking at ways to try and get in earlier and work with kind of secondary schools and colleges with teachers who have just found students who feel like they want to work creatively, and to professionalise that work. So hopefully the 15-year-old who starts off on a programme we're launching next year, by the time of 17, 18, maybe making work that is for any audience professional and is touring and is sort of led by those people. But we also want to take artists with us. So we want to kind of, whether it's through our associate schemes or the artists that we're kind of commissioning and developing work with, we want that conversation to be meaningful. So actually just, sadly, the most radical thing you can do with teenagers is just kind of create a space and then get out of the way and let them own that space and talk. And the conversation that comes back in all the years I've worked in theatre is much more exciting than even I'd kind of imagined a year ago. And I think it allows us as a company, I suppose, to work in different ways in different spaces. Like if we're conceiving work for kind of more kind of gig-based venues or kind of working outside of kind of theatre auditoriums or kind of theatre buildings, which to most teenagers just don't feel friendly and accessible, then we can ask a whole different set of questions with designers much, much earlier and then kind of embed that across 2 years, if not longer.
Yeah, I mean, would you say you feel, do you recognise some of what Rob is saying there about how long it takes to feel that you're professionally sort of...
sort of. I guess it like I've made for me, I've made different stuff at different scales at different points, like 3 years or so since I've graduated, and I don't think I felt more or less professional maybe when I was making them. In fact, some of the stuff that I made just like with a friend has felt like the most creative, brilliant, fulfilling stuff, and then the stuff that might be the other stuff less so. But I guess I guess I've always felt like I don't know, what do you...
Yeah, I agree with you. I think weirdly the stuff that you make when you're younger is when you do have more time and you're a bit naive about everything, and you make, you know, and you go hell for leather and you're just like, this is wicked, and the person, you know, next to you is the same, you know, you're both like 20 and you're making some random work in an old building or something, and that could feel like the most potent time to be creating work.
I often feel like I'm trying to, like, I mean, not that I'm doing, or like I did a really nice project with a friend once where we just like covered this floor in Vaseline. Vaseline, and he just swam around on it, and we just like recorded it and put it on this like porn website. It was so great. I always think of that as like, yeah, me at my probably most professional. Because I really felt like it was me, and me making something that was
you
like...
didn't have a building that was that you were making that work in.
There was no conversation apart from the conversation that was between me and him.
Yeah.
So it's just about the artist, that you didn't need to worry about an audience.
Yeah.
Or
we didn't care.
There was no responsibility to venue. No, I get that. So I mean, is it a case that, you know, having to put something in front of an audience is reductive for you as artists, or
there sometimes can be a certain amount of pressure, but not maybe that you create, that is put on you by, you know, sometimes it's a producer or sometimes it's someone that you know, that idea is way too mental for our building, or like we're not going to sell tickets. People won't watch that. They'll walk out. And you're like, why? Who cares? Like literally, who cares? Like if it's right and it's the thing that we've made and we feel really strongly about it, and we've all come in this group together and to decide to do this thing, then why should it not be scary, or why should it not make people walk out? Or I don't know. I think that's when I remember. Same as Rosie. Like when I think my first job out of uni was in Swansea, in an old Iceland building, and we decided to hang everyone up from the ceiling. And at the start, everyone was like, "Well, I don't know if we can do that. The ceiling's not very stable." And so I was just like, "Well, okay, cool. I'm going to go down to the local like architect people," and I walked in there and I was like, "I just need to come have a look at this ceiling. Just come have a look." And they were like, "Yeah, okay, cool." And they were like, "Oh, it's safe. Yeah, we can drill all these holes," and everyone's like, "Just let, you know, crack on." And I felt so strongly about it because we were just making this weird kind of thing. And originally people were like, "I don't know if that's gonna, you know, if that's okay." And we just did it, and it was awesome. So yeah, I think.
Feels like the stuff that you make when you really when you like feel like it's in you and you make it. That's the stuff that people also like best.
Yeah, they can feel it in you. They can feel it in work.
That's what you're talking about, isn't it? About that profound attachment to a project. It's not just about servicing the vision of a director, but actually feeling it much more.
Yeah, I think it's that thing about anticipating what an audience will or won't like is really interesting and tricky, because I think sometimes those questions come from fear and come from a place of going, look, they like this other thing that we did, so that's told us that this works, so can we do that again? You know, or a bit, or somewhere. That's quite deep, isn't it? I don't mean that in as flippant as it sounded, but like quite deep. We sort of think these are the things that that make people feel okay and that work and so that's what those are the parameters, and then like we can sort of do some different things within those parameters. And I think it's kind of about also respecting and trusting your audience, and thinking of them as people like you, I guess, or kind of going, you know, what is that interaction that you want to have with them? That's something that we talked about a lot when we made the show together, that had really started with wanting it to feel like a conversation and with people in a room, and that did kind of get a lot of those demons out of the way, actually, because we were going, well, it's just about a group of people listening to a story together, and if that's our starting point, then we can sort of trust ourselves. Whereas I don't know, I think there's lots of things to say about that, but there's lots of things about worrying about impressing people and worrying about our anticipation of what people are going to be comfortable with. Yeah, sorry, I've sort of waffled there.
No, not at all. I think another area that I think would be quite interesting to just touch on a little bit before we sort of hand over to anyone wanting to ask questions is the subject of diversity, really, in terms of designers. I have to say that in all the years that I've been engaging designers and the Limber Prize, I feel disheartened by how many people of colour I see coming through, and there's a question there about what's happening there. Why is that? Why?
What in like different from writers and directors, or just different the arts in general?
Yeah, specifically different from writers and directors.
Well, I suppose it's less known as a career, which is like quite a big part of it. So you might.
So Rob, you need to do a lot of work in that area with your 15 to 19-year-olds.
Like in the same way that we've asked the question about actors on stage, and if you don't see yourself on stage, then you don't feel like that space is for you.
Yeah.
Design language in this country is often quite monocultural as well, I think, probably as a result of a certain monoculture that leads on that as designers. And so I think that sort of, to break that, needs very different questions being asked about references and about the impact of those references on stage design. I think if you are of a cultural background that is not white and European, watching work that isn't specifically located in another place, how often are you looking at design that feels truly distinctive and different and culturally other to whatever you know yourself? You know, if you look at, I think what's going to happen with a generation of writers right now is, you know, Netflix have commissioned work for specific territories, let's say in Japan, and then play that across the whole platform. So if you're a young person growing up watching content, storytelling, narrative now, you are being influenced by work outside of your own storytelling language and culture that's being made for others that you're able to look at. And that will have an impact on kind of how you see stories. I think if you go to the theatre and you watch a certain language that comes from a certain culture, then perhaps you don't necessarily feel that looks like the world you've grown up in. And so perhaps that doesn't feel in a way like a space you can control and own.
How do you feel about what Rob's saying there? Do you recognise any of that?
Well, I suppose it's like, it's not, yeah, I guess you need to be able to imagine making something new, or being able to make something of your own if you're going to go into a job. So if you go and see, look, I think there's a not just a problem with diversity, mostly being white, but also class in design.
Absolutely.
It's also like
I
a massive
agree.
thing, and I think it's there's not a massive conversation about who made the thing you're looking at, which I guess this is what we're talking about. But I was having a conversation with somebody about the work they make, that, and I've forgotten the name of the designer. Jan,
yes.
And that these spaces that are very fashionable at the moment, these very white, kind of clean spaces, and we're imagining that those are slightly don't connect to class or race in any way, but they totally they do. And we're kind of, I guess there's a language of our language of that we're beginning with in theatre, I think, is extremely white and extremely middle class. And how do you ask people to, I don't know, make work when that's all they're seeing? I don't know, really. It doesn't feel very inviting.
And do you feel that that's a cultural barrier for people of colour, for example, kind of thinking, actually, this isn't a career pathway for me? Because
I mean, I don't know, really, I guess is the answer to your question, because I'm just myself. But
no, sure.
Yeah, but I guess there's a very much a history of kind of music and other art forms made by non-white people, but maybe there isn't much of a history, so maybe it's more about asking people, could you please make something, and we'd like it to look like something you've made, not in our set of rules.
Sure.
Sure. And I think it's really listening to people. I mean, yeah, you have to change the way that you make things, I think, and to ask new people to make things, because otherwise you're saying, do this thing in the way that we've done it, and is very complicated, I think. Yeah.
I mean, I think in the last 20 years or so, I certainly feel there's been a real shift as well in terms of how many amazing female designers are now at the top of their game. And I mean, obviously we've got 2 female designers here. I mean, Ellen, you think as well in terms of gender and diversity that perhaps there's been historically, you know, a male director leading on a project, and you were talking about it a little bit earlier. If you want to sort of explain a bit about that.
I don't know. Yeah, this is again my kind of like lazy assumptions about history, unresearched. But I suppose because you said to me, it seems as though, you know, that a lot more women now in design, and
colleges,
you know, and when you look at the kind of winners of the Limbury, it's often mostly women, hardly any men. And I suppose in one way that's progressive and good, and in another way I suppose like I slightly wonder about the model, like just going back to the sort of structures and the way we think and the way our culture works, that there's a thing, isn't there, about like you know, if we're thinking that designers are there to support the vision of the director, and if the director's often a white man, it's not so surprising somehow that the support, do you know, I don't know, that's so, there's a part of me that just wonders how you know,
We had an interesting conversation
I don't know what
once,
to do
which
with
was
that
which was about what you expect from a designer, which I thought you said something really insightful about, was if we want designers to kind of design anything, so any designer can take any play and make a brilliant design, it doesn't really matter who they are. If you're looking for somebody to do that, you might be looking for somebody that's kind of blank in a way, and or that's neutral. And I think as a world, we think of white man as neutral. So I don't know whether that's kind of connected to what you were saying.
Which is also to do with that, I think that idea about neutral, and also the idea that, I think you said this, Rosie, in the same conversation, about the idea that maybe as a designer you can sort of lend yourself to any show, or you can go, okay, this is the day where I'm going to do this kind of show, and then tomorrow I'm going to do this other kind of show, and as a designer you're a chameleon in a way, and you can sort of do anything. And I think that's true and is evidenced by brilliant designers everywhere. But I think there's also a conversation to be had about the designer as an artist who has things that they're good at, and things that a way that they see the world that is then going to inform the choices that they make, and that's why you might choose that designer over somebody else. And so those things I think that's quite a complex thing, because it's always, both things are always at play. Where are we going with this? Sorry.
No, I see that, absolutely. I mean, I think we're probably going to have to move on so that people here have an opportunity to ask the panel anything they want, really. So if anyone has a question that they'd like to ask or to elaborate on anything that's been said. Yes.
You were saying before that you felt much more free to create. And I'd like to know what do you think now it restricts your creativity? Is time, is money, is the theatre, is the work on the I don't know.
I mean, I'd personally say time, and what we were saying earlier about having to work on lots of projects to enable you to live, and that therefore restricts your time, and the lack of time restricts your process. I mean, unless you're an amazingly fast worker, and that's brilliant, but I'm not, I'm quite slow. I think that's my personal thing, is time in a room with people. I think that's the thing. But I think it's all, I don't think there's only one thing. I think it's all it can all just be encompassed into one. You know, we don't have time because we don't have enough money. So I think it's not only one whole thing. I think it's just I think everything's kind of interlinked in that way. But for me, I think it's time. I think people want to have, you know, theatres want you to be brave and want you to create amazing work with people. It's just, time is the thing for me that doesn't allow that sometimes.
Rosie?
Well, it's not like it's not that I was once really creative and now I don't feel
not.
creative at all, but it's just different. I guess the thing that I feel makes me most creative or uncreative is the kind of process that I'm allowed to have up to putting a thing on stage, and I'm finding more and more that the thing that changes that the most is the other person or the other people in the room that you're making the thing with. So I guess I'm working with when I was making stuff not really being paid, I was choosing my collaborators because I loved them and because they were the people that I wanted to make stuff with. And now that's not the case now. I work with different sorts of people, but it's more about brains, space to imagine stuff.
And actually, when you have a really amazing relationship with the director, you become brave enough as a group or a pair to ask for more time from the theatre. And I think that's the thing is, you know, we think as designers sometimes, as young designers, we come into a theatre with a set of rules, like you have to have a white card in by this point, you have to have a final model in by this point. And sometimes, as a young designer, I feel afraid to question that. And actually, it's really brilliant when you're working with a director and you're like, we just need 2 more weeks, or we're really almost there. Can we move this, or can, you know, and to actually have that power as a joint collaborator to be like, we actually aren't ready, we're not ready to build this, like I have not built a model, I haven't built a model, like it's just in my head. And actually to say, you know, can we have, and actually the answer is nearly always yes. they will try and work it out for you. It's, you know, but when you have that kind of good collaboration.
So it's important to sort of ask, really.
Yeah,
to
ask,
challenge.
yeah. Because I think sometimes we feel like we need to be quiet. We need to adhere to all these rules that are set out. These rules that, like what we were saying, are years and years and years old, that actually haven't moved on from the way that we, as collaborators, like to make work now, want to make work now. And I think actually buildings are really ready to have that conversation. Sometimes I need to have a bit of a backbone sometimes to be like, can you make this happen? And then I think people will start, you know, sometimes people might dig their heels in a little bit, but the majority of the time they'll give you that space. So,
cool.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have a question? Yes, at that.
Yeah. I thought it was a really interesting sentence that you just said, like designers supporting the director. And I'm coming from the Netherlands, and I noticed there's like big development in especially like theater designers who are now getting more independent. So they're more like art installation based designers at the moment. And I think this is something to do with the tendency between this sentence that you just mentioned, like designers wanting to have more freedom, and maybe they feel that working with a director they can't get like the amount of freedom, and then start working more for themselves. So the question to the designers is actually like, do you also feel this tendency? And for the director, like, how much freedom are you willing to give the designer?
Where should we start? Let's start with Ellen. How much freedom are you willing to give your designer? As much.
Do you want it in hours? No. I think it's about knowing who you're working with at the beginning, and like I said, like those early conversations that are actually not about what the show is going to look like or what the design is going to be, but that are about the kind of deeper questions about why you're doing it. That for me, I think that's the really important thing, because then I really trust what a designer then comes back with, if I know we've had that and we've really met each other in that kind of moment. So with the Unknown Island, there was this kind of very early conversation we had about the story, and then Rosie sent me some images, and I just kind of knew one of those images was like really interesting for us to look at for the show. And then when we met, there was this kind of amazing thing where Rosie said, there's just one image in the collection I sent you that I think could be the one, and I said, is it the blue one? She said yes. And it was sort of like, but I sort of felt like that came about because we had really understood, and at that point I kind of went, well then that's what, you know, I suppose that's the best version of it, isn't it? Yeah. But I think it's really important I'm not a designer, and I can't see it in that way, so you have to trust, but it's about making sure you're working with the right person from the beginning.
What was the first?
So basically, like, how do you feel the tendency between wanting to break free as a designer, like not making it, maybe in a way, like also feeling sometimes working for a director you have to make certain compromises. Like, how is this for you? Do you feel sometimes like I want to be more like an independent art installation kind of designer, or?
I don't, as a person who's made installations, I never felt like the reason I make installations is because I can't get the conversation that I want out of the director. It's for me personally, it's just an exploration of my practice. Like, I don't make art installations because I don't get what I want from a director. We love making shows, but as visual people, there might be a pathway or something that you really love that you want to explore without a director. So I don't think it's from having a lack of, from that relationship. It just, if anything, working with the director on a show inspires me more to go and think about something else, think about that thread, that thing that I loved about that work, and explore it in another way in my own time. I don't think that it's...
I'm definitely not an installation artist at all. Like, I was talking to somebody the other day, somebody I work with, and they were saying the thing about your designs is they're not that interesting until they have people in them. And I think that's probably, for me anyway, I'm not really interested in making a thing for somebody to come and look at. Mm-hmm. And I love working, and I sort of feel like I need to work with the director because they understand how to use bodies in a way that I don't know, and that's the thing that I love doing in the world, is making stuff. people to be in.
Yeah, I
So
also
they're
don't
sort
know
of
how it is in England, obviously.
Yeah.
Like, but it's just something I noticed in the Netherlands that people are getting like more like independent suddenly, like. Okay.
And do you mean that in the sense of it being design-led, a project being design-led as opposed to
They're just
different
becoming
form?
their own directors, basically. So they're making
I
like
see, okay.
great installations, and we have a lot of them right now at the moment. So I don't know how to say it, but, and they basically like they direct the whole thing, like the way the audience what they're in, the feeling they want to give them. So scenography is also a bit of like the directing part in a way. And they sometimes do it like all by themselves, like sometimes working with lighting design.
Yeah.
But it's just like artists, like designers collaborations. You see them coming up more, in my opinion, than the traditional way of designers working for directors in a way. So that's why I wonder how it is here.
Very much touching on that question as well, actually. Earlier you were discussing, I think it was you were mentioning getting in touch with the youth of today and breaking down the stereotypes of what theatre is and trying to show them that they can take on these other jobs and they are not a regimented structure of specific jobs as well. And I was wondering if roles such as designers and directors and similar roles to that, are we finding that they're breaking down already at all? Has anyone any recollection of designers and directors sort of amalgamating all the waters between their roles muddying, or even designers being directors on one show and designers on another, or vice versa?
In terms of actual people, I don't know if we're quite as far along as maybe in the Netherlands. I certainly think like when you talk to sort of young creative brains, there's less of a focus on doing one thing very, very well forever, and trying lots of different things simultaneously. And maybe that's because like how sort of digitally native young people perhaps can kind of like make and create on phones and kind of can sketch and can kind of like share and can kind of, like we saw with Natives, which is a show I did earlier this year, there was like a whole lot of fan art that grew up around some of the artwork from the show, and there were just teenagers who could never come in and see the show, but were kind of like sketching and playing with a lot of the imagery we were putting out and kind of sending that back in. And that seems culturally quite interesting. I think that culture of making and doing it yourself, whether that's what we recognise on YouTube or kind of Tumblr or whatever, there's a sense actually that creativity is more sort of porous and plural and kind of shifting and changing. What that means, and then how you've harnessed that and like put that through kind of a sort of creative training, or kind of how you kind of keep that going, how you keep that brilliant creativity when the rules are kind of there to be broken, when you can Vaseline a floor and do that for yourself and play around. Like that stuff's amazing. That's the stuff you want to kind of protect and hold on to. I suppose for me, like I guess I have an opportunity now in the company to kind of set some of that stuff in motion, so that we're sort of harnessing and amplifying young creativity, as opposed to me imposing a set of, well, there's your white card, there's your process, there's the money you're going to get for this bit of it. I'd like to see more of that, I suppose, and for us, because we are looking at kind of very early career artists who we hope are making work for their peers and contemporaries as well. A bit of mess and a bit of chaos is quite useful. We were talking earlier before we started, like how being playful and kind of getting things wrong, and like the amount of the agonising processes around like digital content. I've sat in so many meetings with marketing departments where we agonise over needing more money to do a perfect video that kind of sits on YouTube brilliantly, which is seen by very few people, and there's a teenager in their bedroom who's just kind of rough cut editing and playing. And I think that kind of creativity right now excites me. How we then get the most of that as we go into kind of design processes in theatre, I think is on us to fix that and to test that. But I'd like to see more of that, I think, because it gets us slightly different results along the way.
But do you think that's a little bit also about the sort of shows that we create and where we create that work, and that flexibility comes from perhaps different types of work and where it's made?
Yeah, I suppose we have our theatre spaces are architecturally largely the same, I suppose. They might be of different scales, but I suppose there are certain rules imposed by end-on theatres or flexible theatres or studio theatres. We try to, if we're working in small spaces, we try to put the biggest show we can in that space, even if it kind of breaks the process a little bit. We want to try and put big experiences on in front of our audience. But yeah, I guess we've received those things as the way we work. And of course, if you're working in very different spaces and found spaces, perhaps there's a bit more freedom to play. And I think our theatre spaces maybe feel quite alien to, again, I'm talking sort of selfishly from our audience and an audience who don't have a vocabulary of theatres, but you step into a lot of spaces, they feel quite alien perhaps to a lot of other spaces you spend time in.
Sure.
So yeah, perhaps.
I think we might have, Tom, time for one more question.
I was just going to say a really quick thing in reply about the roles blurring.
Yeah.
Is that I also feel like the best versions of that collaboration are when you forget who's who, really.
Totally.
And you're actually kind of, some of the best staging ideas come from the designer who says, put the actor here, or have them do this at this moment.
Are you finding that happens frequently then?
Sorry?
Are you finding that happens more frequently?
I think it just depends on the relationship that you have and the process that you go through and how much time you have together in the room, to build that conversation and to have that nuanced understanding of what's being made. But, I think that's a really true collaboration then, rather than one taking care of one thing and the other one taking,
Yeah, absolutely. One last question. Yes. Yes. Just you. With glasses.
Sorry, and so we've touched very briefly on kind of Netflix and stuff like that, and I was just wondering, just because we're talking about the future, what kind of ways do you feel like new media are kind of changing drama as a whole at the moment? Because obviously theatre and TV screen are very separate things, and this kind of new golden age of television is really changing things in the TV drama side of things. How do you think that's changing theatrical drama?
No, it's an interesting question though, because TV, I feel like the more amazing, for me personally, and the more amazing TV and stuff gets, the more brilliant, and it's like, why do that in a theatre?
Yeah.
So it makes me want stuff to be more live, to be less like watching a TV screen.
Because we can never create like our whole thing is never films are films and cinematography is cinematography, and I think why create what you see on they've got a lot more money, they can do it better. They can do like all the big stuff better, I think.
But I guess what they can't do is say like, hi.
Come and have a conversation with us.
We're here together, like we're occupying the same space, so that's the thing, I guess.
Yeah. Tom, sorry, I'm being told that's the end. So listen, thank you very much to our panellists for coming along tonight to talk about their experiences, and thank you all as well for coming along. It's been great to see so many people in the room tonight, so hurrah to the future of theatre design, I think. Thank you.